Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Flubber. And this is the winner of the movie review vote, as selected by one of my patrons on Patreon. If you would like to select a movie to potentially win the movie review vote next month, then pledge to my Patreon, and maybe you will be the winner I will be talking about next month. I noticed a lot of people have a lot of nostalgia for Flubber, and I don't, not because I have any ill will or ill feelings towards this movie. I actually just saw it just now, so for the first time. But I noticed when I looked up reviews on YouTube and such, a lot of the reviews for Flubber were made by people after Robin Williams had died, and how they grew up with this movie and how it meant something. And I was kind of at first like, oh, well, you know, it's just this nostalgic thing and whatever. And as I was researching this movie, I found something actually very interesting, and what this says about Robin Williams' career, actually, believe it or not. The next movie, his other movie that came out in 1997, was Good Will Hunting, which came out around early December. And that would go on to win him the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor, the only Oscar he won. And rightfully so, he's a great actor. But they're both kind of the different sides of Robin Williams, or at least him as a film star. Obviously, he was a comedian. He did other stuff, naturally. But when you think of him, you either think of him, I guess, in more family-friendly entertainment, and then you have him as a really good actor, as a dramatic actor. And it shows very two different sides of him, almost extreme sides of him, which is kind of interesting. And in both, he plays a college professor. And they're both very different movies. And it's kind of what that says about him as an actor, what it says about him as a screen persona, and I think it shows his many levels to it. But also, while watching Flubber, it shows me how, although I don't think this is a perfect film whatsoever, and maybe not an amazing movie necessarily, I think there are a lot of things this film does well that probably critically it didn't get the right attention for at the time, knowing how critics and Siskel and Ebert, who really didn't like this movie, were then. But also shows me how good of an actor Robin Williams was, because a lot of this he got to work in ways that maybe he didn't get the attention for he necessarily deserved, because no one was really fully appreciating everything he really put into this movie. Professor Philip Brainerd, who's about to get married to a woman, Sarah Reynolds, and he keeps forgetting the date, and the university that I guess he runs or then owns, sort of, but they don't really get into it, but that's not really how colleges work, but whatever, is going out of business, and he needs to come up with something, and his life's kind of a mess. And there's a neighboring university, and then he invents this weird thing called Flubber that can make his car fly. It can bounce around and do conga dancing for some reason, but it can make his car fly, and it can do amazing things and be a whole new energy source, and he invented it. It's like flying rubber, basically, so he names it Flubber. So he invents this instead of going to his wedding. But, you know, renewable energy source that could help out the earth for a long time is, like, actually, like, you know, you should be on time for your wedding, but if you do come up with a new energy source that will potentially help the earth and humanity for, like, eons potentially, then that's okay to miss your wedding. If that's like actually, if you succeed, if you fail, it doesn't look so good. But if you actually have done that and you're like, this is happening, just remember that. Don't lie and use that though. Like, actually do that. I mean, you should actually do that anyway, even if you're not getting married. In the grand scheme of things, you really shouldn't. But if you're making a new energy source that could potentially help the earth for eons and eons, I mean, I'm just saying it's a good excuse. You know, you should respect your partner, but if you're like, but hey, we're billionaires and we don't have to use gasoline no more, and you're like, oh, well, okay, that's cool. But if it's something like, I just forgot, then, like, you know, you're an asshole. In this, they think he's an asshole, but really, he's not. I don't know. But he forgets these because, you know, he's the absent-minded professor, but not in this movie. I mean, he is, but not, you know. So, he has a flying robot thing called Weeboo, who's voiced by Jodie Benson, who was the singing voice for Ariel and did a bunch of voiceover stuff. And Weeboo is, like, kind of has a crush on Robin Williams. It's a little weird. But then, Flubber, of course, gets him in a little trouble because one of the sponsors for his university is unhappy with him because he failed his son, because his son wasn't doing well, I guess. So now he's trying to come after him and finds out about Flubber, and people are trying to get Flubber while he's trying to get the girl, and it's all a collision course to wackiness. This is actually the second remake for this director, Les Mayfield, and the second one actually both written by John Hughes. Now, before you freak out and go, oh my god, John Hughes wrote this movie, the John Hughes the 90s, like, nobody really likes that much. If you notice, when he died, it kind of stops at Home Alone. They go, he also, just don't look at his filmography past that too much, Baby's Day Out and all. Like, seriously, like, nobody really likes the 90s stuff. But this is the second time John Hughes had written a remake right after Miracle on 34th Street that Les Manfield also directed. John Hughes produced this film as well. He actually took the original script from The Absent-Minded Professor. This is, of course, by the way, a remake of The Absent-Minded Professor, which is based on a story, A Situation of Gravity, by Samuel W. Taylor, which is a film I actually have more nostalgia for. The Absent-Minded Professor, that's the film I grew up with, which is, I think, a better film, although I haven't seen it in a long time. But the cool thing that John Hughes did is he took the original screenplay and kind of rewrote it from that, and he actually gave credit to the guy who wrote the original screenplay, Bill Walsh, and gave him a posthumous credit, even though he'd been dead for like over a decade. So I think that's actually very classy of John Hughes. He could have actually just not done that. He could have, and I think there's a lot of people who have done that, and maybe you could be justified in that, because this is a very different movie from that, very different in terms of its era and so forth, and I think you could get away with that, no one would really notice. But John Hughes, that's pretty classy, I have to say. This is also shot by Dean Cundey. This film has a lot of great visual gags in it. It has a real good visual sense to it, which makes sense that Dean Cundey shot it, as he's also the guy who shot the opening shot in Halloween, shot the Back to the Future movies. Dean Cundey is one of the most underappreciated DPs, and he does amazing work. I think this film sort of reminds me of another millennial 90s nostalgia movie, which is Space Jam. Not just because it's that era, and I believe the same year or something like that, is that in Flubber, it has this real cartoon sense to it. It's very much made like a cartoon. It's shot like a cartoon, which is a very hard thing for live action to do. There's a lot more failure. Usually, if you're talking about a bad kids film, it's like when they do all these like Bugs Bunny-esque gags and things. And Bugs Bunny can do it, but you really have to have a great actor around the film to get that to work in the way that a Bugs Bunny short would. And in Flubber with Robin Williams, they actually had that. So a lot of this visual stuff that I think would actually fall apart under anybody else works with him. I don't think it's an amazing performance necessarily. I think it's just like, wow, he did all that, you know, and it shows how far he can really go for a film. I think it's a good performance. I don't think it's like as good as like, I think he was much better in Mrs. Doubtfire, or his voice performance in Aladdin, or Good Morning Vietnam, or, you know, other kind of family friendly things. But where he goes there and pulls off these pratfalls, this could just be like an 101 Dalmatians, like with Glenn Close kind of movie, kind of like a 90s family friendly standard one. But Robin Williams like really pulls it off and pushes himself to a certain degree that you're really like kind of more in it than you think, because he's not that developed of a character. That is sort of a problem with this film, is you don't really get as in deep with them, and I think that's kind of something when you get more into how special effects are more readily available, they kind of go maybe a little too all in with that, and they don't think as much about character. And I think in older films, and I've said this many times before, when a special effect took like forever and it was expensive and they didn't do as many, you had to rely on character to really get that to work. And that doesn't mean those films are necessarily better, but I think in Flubber you can see that shift and how that could not work, and I can see how people would be annoyed at that because it flows in a much more cartoony way. But I think that really works, particularly the basketball scene. That's also not why I thought it's sort of maybe why I thought of Space Jam. It's very special effects, kid-friendly, family-friendly sort of movie that is very cartoony. But this doesn't have actual cartoons, unless you count Flubber and Weeaboo and stuff. But particularly the basketball scene, I think really works surprisingly. I think there's a lot of times Robin Williams is doing a lot of big stunt things and effects-heavy things that actually work a lot better because he's really willing to go for it. There's a particular scene actually that I noticed that is just him like crying over Weeaboo, the flying robot thing, and going like, oh my god, I can't believe, you know, you're damaged and what could happen and stuff like that. When you watch the scene, the robot's not really working. There's no special effects in that scene. It's just him like performing, and he's really going for it, by the way. Apparently Will Wheaton, who was in this film as a guy who like gives money to the college and stuff, son, he said there are many times when they do scenes and Robin Williams would want to shoot so many different versions of it with completely different dialogue, and he was saying like it could have been made in so many different ways because Robin Williams really wanted to play and do as much stuff as he could. I think everyone knows he's a great performer, but in that one scene where he's holding Weeaboo, I was like, holy shit, like he's just going for it. Like it's not, I'm not tearing up or anything, but it's just like that. It's hard to do when you're doing effects heavy scenes. You get into more the technical side of acting, which isn't as fun, isn't as amazing. You can kind of just get more on the technical side and not emote and do as many interesting things with it. That's kind of why special effects films aren't known for acting, because not a lot of people can do that, like really act while they're doing the technical side of it. There's very few, like Children of Men might be one of the best at it, but which is what everyone thinks of when they watch Flubber. But I think Robin Williams really is, and in that scene he really goes for it and really pulls off a scene that's just like, you have to be sad over Weeboo, a scene that normally in most kids films would be much more cheesier, and he really gives an earnestness to it, which kind of comes out of left field and doesn't tone-wise work as well, but just shows like that he could do that in this kind of movie and get that to work. Shows a lot of as him as a performer, and kind of makes sense why people kind of favor his family-friendly stuff, because I think in family-friendly stuff you get this kind of fake performance and you don't really feel it's real. You're watching it as a kid and you can tell, like, it's like when you're a kid and there's a difference between a parent talking to you and talking kind of down to you and going like, oh, but you'd like to see Flubber, wouldn't you? And it's different when someone goes like, hey, do you want to like see Flubber? Is that cool? And like there's a realness to that, and I think Robin Williams understood that and did it in an earnest way, and that's probably why you respect him a lot more. And I think that's why it's more of a genuine performance, because most people are doing these kids performances like they're talking to you like, do you want to see Flubber? And you know, you might respond to that as a kid a little bit, but it's not going to stay with you because you know it's fake and it's kind of bullshit and they're talking down to you, and that's demeaning, and who wants to deal with that? And Robin Williams was never demeaning. He always kind of respected you, and he knew he needed to give the best performance he could, and he probably got paid a lot, so he probably should have done that too. This film is very much of its time, and the Flubber technology, CGI, I don't think is great. The conga line, all that stuff, it's just like, look, Flubber is playful, but it plays like a Super Bowl Pepsi commercial or something. Okay, like you did this, but like, what are you doing with it? It sort of works because this film is so special effects heavy. I don't think it's a part I necessarily think of as the highlight. I'm sure it was, I knew it was all over the dumb ads and stuff. I also like that Marcia Gay Harden was in this. You don't see a lot of like age-appropriate love interests in movies, especially now, and it's kind of interesting because she's like, I actually didn't look up who was older, but she at least looked age-appropriate. Like sometimes you're like Robin Williams and Cameron Diaz or something like that, and you'd be like, I don't know if that works, but okay. I like Jodie Benson as Weeboo. It seems like everybody, even reviews they don't like, they're like, why isn't there more time with Weeboo? And I'm like, I think that whole relationship gets a little weird, especially for a kid's film. It's like a total side tangent that was not in The Absent-Minded Professor. Like, why are we doing it? But I like her performance, and I like the technology of Weeboo. I think it's kind of cool. I like Christopher McDonald, who's an actor I think people don't appreciate, but from SLC, especially SLC Punk, but also Happy Gilmore and stuff. But he's actually rather good at the villainous bad guy. I kind of like him as a villain. I wish more people would have him as a villain, especially after watching this. And I especially like seeing Will Wheaton, believe it or not. I think it's a film that got unnecessarily over criticized because it's hard to do these kind of physical performances and pull them off, and I think Robin Williams actually does. Like, not very many people can really do Bugs Bunny, and maybe Robin Williams was one of the very few that could. Now this was the time where like Jim Carrey got a lot of shit at the time, and now we act like Liar Liar is one of his great performances, but that wasn't the feeling at the time. And I think Robin Williams is similar in that most of his family-friendly stuff didn't get the praise like Good Will Hunting did, and that's what people kind of remember him for being a great actor. I would argue that I don't think this is a better performance than Good Will Hunting or a better movie, but I would say that he can do this shows how great of a technical actor he was, that he could pull this off as well as he does, and I think that doesn't necessarily get appreciated for. Now you can get into like, they don't award things and criticism doesn't really get into acting like that and all this stuff like that, but I think Flubber shows like kind of how well he could get something that feels like kind of a standard Disney remake and make it a little more interesting and make it a little more fun. It has a real fun cartoony vibe to it, which is probably because of Dean Cundy's a great DP. He had a John Hughes script at the height of his family friendliness, and really everyone I think was able to play off that and make a fairly enjoyable family friendly movie. I went into this thinking like, oh man, you know, this won the movie review vote, I'm gonna like give this probably a bad review because I was kind of not so into it. I love The Absent-Minded Professor and I loved growing up with it, and even at the time I was like, why are they remaking it? The first one's so good. But I think the kind of weird kind of other way this film went, in some ways like the Weeboo relationship's just strange, but when they get to the real absent-minded professorness and the cartoony nature of Flubber, I think this film really shines and works in a lot of ways that a lot of these films like the Inspector Gadget live action thing or other like big special effects heavy family friendly films didn't. And it's such a different tangent, you can kind of respect it in the same way that you can like Absent-Minded Professor. They kind of work as totally different movies, which is probably the smarter thing to do, as The Absent-Minded Professor I believe is still a a big kids movie, right? Is it? I don't know. But regardless, I think Flubber is a happy kind of addition to kind of that franchise or whatever, and Robin Williams was almost the perfect person to do that, making this kind of a fun, enjoyable capsule from the 90s that you'd be surprised how well most of it holds up, even if it isn't the strongest thing overall. So if you have seen Flubber and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And if you would like to enter a movie into the movie review vote, then click on the link below for my Patreon and pledge, and maybe you will be the winner next month. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.